Okay, so here we are with this lesson on factors that tend to affect populations. Um, there was an event in Australia called the Great Australian Rabbit Disaster. We're going to watch a little clip on that in class tomorrow. But basically, when people were immigrating to Australia, from home they brought with them rabbits. And they introduced the rabbits into the new habitat that was Australia, their new home. And unfortunately, for many reasons, the population of rabbits skyrocketed and got really, really out of hand. So a question then, if we introduce a species into an environment, would that population just continue to increase forever without no end? And so this is a question to think about, why or why not? And of course, the answer that you may have come up with is no. There isn't a constant increase to a population, because as a population grows, the rabbits, then more and more and more of them in this population, they would need to share resources. So they would need to share things like food, and the numbers eventually would become very limited because there would be less food available for all of them. And as soon as that happens, the rabbits then would become stressed. Okay, some of them would die, and then others would be unable to reproduce. And so after a while, there would be fewer births happening, and there would be more deaths happening. And eventually, the population will enter a state of equilibrium. Okay, what in this case equilibrium means is that we have a balance between the number of births and the number of deaths. And that's equilibrium. The population will become even. Okay, so we're going to talk about this in regards to populations, because the diagram below, there's a little graph down below, shows a rabbit population that was introduced to a new habitat. And after a while, the number of rabbits does not change. And that's because the habitat reaches what we call its carrying capacity. And this is a very, very important term, carrying capacity. We're going to define it. The carrying capacity is defined as the maximum number of individuals that an ecosystem can support without reducing its ability to support future generations of the same species. Okay? If we want to look at this graphically, what this means is that here on the x-axis of our graph, we have population. So the population, the number of organisms in a certain habitat. And here on the x-axis, we have time. And so we'll notice that for a little bit of time, we get the population increasing, but eventually this interesting thing happens at the top, is that the population, if we zoom right in, starts to kind of go up, and then it falls a little bit, and then it goes up, and then it falls a little bit, and basically it wobbles around this dotted line, and this dotted line is what we call the carrying capacity. So sometimes it's a little bit higher, sometimes it's a little bit lower, but basically it wobulates back and forth along this dashed line, which is known as the carrying capacity. And this is the maximum number of individuals that the ecosystem can support. Okay? More than that, and the ecosystem we start to get into some troubles. There's various combinations of abiotic and biotic factors that cause populations to increase or decrease. Now, the interesting thing is that most of the time, these things are taken care of by nature, and they're called limiting factors. Sometimes, however, humans mess things up, and we need to impose factors as well, like things like hunting, etc., etc. Sometimes, if a population's getting too out of control, humans will step in and help to regulate so that populations don't get too big. Unfortunately, there's also things that humans do that make populations get too small. And we'll talk about some of those as we talk about sustainability. Here are some of the things that are not living in an ecosystem, the abiotic factors that will limit the size of a population. Things like natural disturbances, right? So fires, storms, and droughts. These are going to limit populations. Human disturbances, deforestation or urbanization. These things will limit factors because there's less room. Also, things like the amount of water, the amount of sunlight, the amount of soil, the amount of land. These are abiotic things, not living, that are going to limit how big populations can get. If there's only so much water to go around, a population can't keep on growing. It's going to get lower. Here are some things that are some things that are living that limit population growth. The presence of disease carrying organisms. Okay, so the amount of bacteria, how many sick organisms are in the area. So the presence of disease carrying organisms. Predators, right? If there's more predators in an area, then the population of the prey is going to be limited if there's more predators. Some things like competition for food, water, and territory amongst the species and within a species. And last but not least, reliance on other species. We've talked about food chains and what would happen if this part of a food chain disappeared. What would happen if this part of a food chain became more plentiful? And what kind of trickle-down effect does that have? All of these are key aspects in looking at populations. And we're going to talk a lot more about this in class when we play the Wolfpack game and when we watch a few videos on some of this information.